Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Policy-CSR breakdown. It's been so long since I've last created an episode. Today, I am here accompanied by Daveon Coleman. I thank you so much in advance for your time. And I'd love for you to introduce yourself, share a little bit about your career journey, what you've witnessed in terms of environmental policies during your time at Earth Justice, and share whatever else you think needs to be shared for our guests.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Athena. As you said, my name's Daveon Coleman.
Mhm.
I am the Senior Advisor in Communications for Learning and Development at Earth Justice, the premier environmental law organization that's been working to protect people in the environment for the last 50 years. I've been with the organization for a little bit over 10 years now, and I've had various positions. Started out as a media associate, really tracking our earned media and how we were influencing the narrative in the news space on our issues, and have had the privilege of leading and mentoring teams in our public affairs and advocacy team over the last several years, and really building out the advocacy communications aspect of Earth Justice's work, bringing in grassroots organizers and online to offline action, as well as influencing decision makers that are really important for making sure that policy and environmental protections are carried through. So that's been a really great opportunity for me to learn and grow in my career, as well as the new work that I've been doing, leading our learning and development program within the communications department, attacking some of the biggest problems in the communication space around shifting attitudes and also ways of reaching people. The current internet ecosystem is very different than it was even 5 or 10 years ago, about how people learn about things, how they engage with content, where that content lives on the internet, and how to reach people. So we're always trying to stay on the cutting edge of how to be great and effective communicators to reach our goals within Earth Justice. And it's a new challenge to equip our team with the best practices and training that they need to stay as effective communicators.
Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing. I really wanted to bring you in this month in particular, as it's Earth Month. I would love for you to talk a little bit about some important environmental policies that people might be less aware of and that have suffered in the midst of a Trump era, as well as I know that recently you were talking about some recent lawsuits that Earth Justice has initiated. So if you want to explore that as well, that'd be wonderful.
Yes. So in my time at Earth Justice, it's been interesting. I've been through now 4 presidential cycles, the end of the Obama administration through the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the beginning of the second Trump administration. So
Mm.
it's been a little bit of whiplash in terms of thinking about environmental policy, and how that's impacted the work that we do. And I can go into some of the more specific examples that folks may not be aware of, or
Mhm.
how that's impacted folks over time and environmental policy. But when I first came into Earth Justice working in the environmental space, there were a lot of really powerful and potentially game-changing policies that the Obama administration were enacting. These were sometimes controversial, but also, I think, moving in a direction that the environmental movement wanted them to move in, around things like the Climate Action Plan, the Clean Power Plan, a lot of conservation efforts that were happening at the end of the Obama administration, where I think 265 million acres of public lands and waters were protected around Pacific remote marines islands. So these are things that protected from overfishing, they protected from offshore drilling. This was more than any other president, I believe, up until that point. The
Mhm.
United States played a key role in negotiating the Paris Agreement in 2015, and there were a lot of different public health initiatives like the mercury air toxic standard. So this was an effort to reduce pollution from coal-fired power plants,
Mhm.
and that also helped to update drinking water standards. And
Mhm.
these are a lot of the same policies that were protecting air and water quality from those industries. And a lot of that was kind of rolled back in the first Trump administration. So you
Mhm.
saw things like the Paris Agreement being left, abandonment of the Clean Power Plan
Mhm.
during the first Trump administration. There was also opening of a lot of federal lands and waters to oil and gas leasing, including the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is an ongoing fight that we're in today in Earth Justice. There's also water and quality standards like the Waters of the United States rule. So this actually defines what are the waters that are protected by federal policy under the Clean Water Act. And a lot of ephemeral waters like seasonal wetlands used to be included in that, and those have been removed during the Trump administration, both one and two, which creates gaps in the ability to protect clean water where these ephemeral streams live. These are also key places for migratory birds to that live and hunt and fish when they're traveling and migrating. So it has lots of impacts not only on our personal water quality for people, but also how these different wildlife are impacted by it. So that's been a big thing. The Biden administration brought in, I think, a lot of really interesting and revelatory work in the environmental space with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. So this was a major environmental win in terms of funding for renewable energy and putting in some real dollars to government funding to bring in climate policies. So over $350 billion were allocated under the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act to address some of these issues in supply chains. There were a lot of regulations around around EV regulations and emissions. So this affects the car industry and obviously a lot of pollution comes from that the Biden administration was able to address. We were rejoining the Paris Agreement. We were looking at different ways in which the climate change could be addressed. And we had another shift with the second Trump administration where we left the Paris Agreement again. So that's a little bit of the whiplash that I think we're talking about that also, prevents the United States in particular being a leader globally on climate and addressing climate issues, which are a global issue, and also a lot of deregulatory actions. This was part of a lot of the administrative deregulation that we've heard about or read about in policy briefings and white papers like the Project 2025 document. A lot of that a significant portion of that deregulatory work and dismantling of the administrative state impacts the environment. So we saw a lot of air and water quality rules being impacted by the Trump administration in the last year and a half. Climate and energy transitions have been impacted. We're looking at a lot of agency restructuring. So the EPA and the way that they're evaluating the costs and the scientific basis for a lot of their policy is being rewritten under this administration. And that obviously impacts the quality and the breadth of the policies that are coming out of the administration in terms of protecting public health and the environment. Permitting has been a big thing that we've paid attention to. The National Environmental Policy Act is one of those issues that people really don't maybe know about that I like to go into that really helps people understand sort of the underpinnings of environmental policy. The National Environmental Policy Act was a law passed in 1970 that really looked at how the federal government addresses any kind of building project that happens in the United States. So if there's federal dollars being spent at any point, that requires a environmental policy analysis that includes public participation. So obviously the people who may be impacted by a road being built or any kind of a pipeline for gas or oil, those require the federal government to look at the environmental impacts of those projects and to offer alternatives if necessary to where a pipeline can be placed or whether it should be built at all. And that was a really major shift in terms of empowering the public to have a voice in what happens in these things. And those rules have been significantly shifted under the Trump administration in the last couple of years to really allow for expedited pathways for industry to get approvals, narrowing the scope of what the environmental analysis looks like in terms of how it may impact the different ecosystems or biodiversity within an area, how it may impact public health. Those have been narrowed to make it easier to greenlight these projects. So that seems like kind of a boring administrative nugget that people maybe not they don't see, but it is a really important way of showing how the government is held accountable to protect the environment, how industry has to meet certain standards if they want to build something or do something, as well as give the public an opportunity to show how that impacts them. And NEPA is especially interesting to groups like Earth Justice, which are law organizations, because it is specifically able to be enforced through public interest litigation. So the people are able to hold the government accountable when they're not doing this analysis. And that is a key provision that I think balances a lot of the influence that industry may have on policy making. So NEPA is a really important law that we're really fighting to protect currently and to make sure that it lives up to the spirit in which it was written. Another key environmental issue that folks may not know about as much is the endangerment finding. So this is a little bit around how the environment and the law really shape policy in terms of understanding what actually gets covered under environmental law. And one of the issues at hand where the endangerment finding came out was in a 2009 Supreme Court ruling on Massachusetts v. EPA. So this was really around understanding what kinds of pollution were regulated under the Clean Air Act, and it determined in this finding that the pollution from cars and also pollution from coal-fired power plants, things like that, were greenhouse gases specifically were the kinds of pollution that impacted public health. And the EPA was ordered to study the impacts of them and create policies that would protect public health from greenhouse gas emissions. So I think folks typically understand clean air and clean water in terms of how heavy metals that may be leaking from power plants impact folks, but the greenhouse gases that increase and exacerbate the climate issues were also determined to be covered. So the policies that sort of emerged from that were things like the Clean Power Plan under the Obama administration, that now are in trouble because that determination has been shifted in the current Trump administration. So the ways in which we determine what is even dangerous and what we
Mm.
choose to enforce is being attacked at a fundamental level. And I think that's where it's not as visible to the public in terms of how environmental policy has been impacted.
Right. All of that was such incredible insight. Thank you for sharing. My next question is, I'd love to learn a little bit more about the influence of corporate lobbying power, and how corporate money affects these policies that safeguard the environment.
I think it's always been a issue around any kind of policy around where the line of where corporations play into this. So when you're thinking about policy making, all of the stakeholders within an economy and industry should be at the table to determine what is the best way to move forward. When you're thinking about corporations, they're enacting a lot of the daily operations and creating a lot of the materials that drive our daily lives. So, in a vacuum, the way that they do those things, what their supply chains look like, what their processes of refining or producing products looks like, they determine that in a lot of ways and should be able to talk about how environmental policy from the government impacts their industries, what it costs to be in compliance. On the other side of that, the public also has an interest. So the people who live next to these industries, the people who are using the products created by these industries, the externalities of these industries on our air, our water, the climate, on ecosystems, on species, should also be taken into account when the government is creating policies that ostensibly should be protecting the public interest at the end of the day. That is the position that we hold at Earth Justice, and that is why we fight in the interests of the public, because ultimately, while all of these things are factors into determining transparency of reporting from industries, so we know exactly what they're using in terms of chemicals, in terms of processes, in terms of the impacts or the how much of those chemicals are being discharged into our water, into our air. Those are all things that the government can and has wanted compliance with, and then also determining what the impacts of those processes are. So having accurate scientific information that looks at the long-term, short-term, and acute effects of these industries is something that protects the public interest. And then developing reasonable protective standards that protect the public for the long term and the short term is the mandate of the government. So there's always been that interplay in the Trump administration, and specifically in the first Trump administration. We did find that there was an exorbitant amount of industry involvement in a lot of those policies. So when you really look at the way some of these things played out, that really looked at different industries like the coal industry, specifically a leaked memo that was in a New York Times article at the time in 2017 from Robert Murray from Murray Industries, which is a major coal supplier and manufacturing, had a wish list of all of the different policies that the Trump administration should be getting rid of. And when you look at what some of the first 100 days of the Trump administration were doing, it kind of followed that wish list to the T. So these are organizations that were donating a lot of money to the inauguration campaign at the
Mm.
time and influencing a lot of the things that you saw coming out of the Trump administration. So that influence was definitely there, and it's been documented through these New York Times articles and leaked documents that we've seen in the and similarly, when you look at the folks that have been put into key positions within the administration, that there are clear industry ties that you definitely can't ignore that we see. Yes, exactly. Where it's kind of the fox guarding the hen house in a lot of different
Definitely.
ways.
Definitely. I remember for one of my graduate classes, we had to write a memo on Rex Tillerson and his involvement in a government role following his so many years at a fossil fuel industry, so, at a specific fossil fuel company. Honestly, I want to say it was Exxon, but it's been some time since I've written it. But it was definitely like the strong conflict of interest is something that's super important to talk about. Another thing I wanted to ask is that, at first glance, it might seem that only these fossil fuel and coal companies, at first glance, it might seem that only fossil fuel companies and lobbying influence these harmful environmental outcomes. But I was curious as to what other companies and sectors are benefiting from rollbacks on environmental protections and policies and might even be investing in it as well.
The breadth of industry in this country, things like NEPA, for instance, where if you're going to build anything with federal dollars, even if it's, $1 federal, it has to have sort of an environmental analysis. There are industries that are going to be impacted by that across the board. So obviously, you're looking at the fossil fuel industry where you have oil and gas that's coming out of federal lands in many instances. It's being pipelined and transported across the country. It's being refined and processed in communities. So that's going to have impacts on their industries. But you look at the secondary industries or the tertiary industries around that, when you look at the plastics industry, for instance, that are using a lot of the fossil fuels to create products that we use every day. The construction industry, for instance, when you look at the creation and transportation of things like cement, that also has environmental externalities, and the reporting structures, the compliance, the narrowing of analysis, and the gutting of scientific analysis on the impact of those industries all in some ways benefit them from having to bear the costs of those industries and externalize them onto the public. So when they're not doing their diligence to be in compliance, to be reporting and working with the government to know exactly how their industries are impacting our public health and our environment, they should be paying for that. If there's something to be cleaned up, if there's something to be mitigated, if there's something to be prevented, that shouldn't be externalized onto the public. And all of these systems that are in place, like NEPA and a lot of the federal agencies like EPA, are there to make sure that that kind of thing happens. And when that doesn't happen, that obviously keeps money in those industries' pockets. The mining industry, even in industries like that where there's massive externalities of hard rock mining, the policies in place that we have and how strong they are definitely have impacts on that. So outside of oil and gas, there's a lot of different ways that that impacts industries where there may be benefits that they're getting from not having those costs internalized, and also the cost to the public of dealing with that pollution and issues that stem from that in the short term and long term.
Definitely. Since we're talking about long-term effects, I'd love for you to explore the concept of environmental racism and share how communities of color bear the greatest brunt of these changes in environmental policy.
Yeah, when you look at certain industries, they are really concentrated in areas where there are disproportionate amount of low income people, of indigenous people, of Black and brown communities that have been disproportionately impacted. The concept of environmental racism comes from a civil rights leader that was really working on this issue in North Carolina in the 1980s. It was coined by Dr. Ben Chavis Jr. He was the first person to use the term environmental racism. And what he was really commenting on is the impact that environmental pollution has that is disproportionate on these communities. So it is de facto racism where they are bearing the brunt of the cost of these industries. When you look at places like Cancer Alley, for instance, this is a region where a lot of the oil refining happens in the United States, and it is a disproportionately Black and low income area. And the cancer rates are incredibly high compared to the rest of the country there because of the pollution that they are exposed to on a regular basis. Those fence line communities, those communities that are near those industries, are disproportionately impacted. When you look at cities, for instance, even with car traffic and the pollution that comes from cars, the roads that are chosen to be put into those communities, the highways that cut across those communities, are disproportionately in Black and brown communities. And when you look at the asthma rates and the rates of missed days of school, there's extensive data to show that respiratory infections and respiratory disease from car pollution in those communities has been shown to be higher. So the epidemiology and the external effects of that are very well documented, and there have been offices of in every federal office that deal with civil rights that are tasked with looking at how environmental racism in particular are affecting these communities and doing investigations. Those have been not really enforced by the Trump administration or other administrations, to be completely honest. There has been a dearth of due diligence in those areas that have done a disservice to a lot of these communities in the past.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. The next question that I wanted to ask is if you could think of any for-profit companies that are actively lobbying for improved environmental protections and policies, because it's my understanding and from my research that for-profit companies love to talk about their sustainability efforts and their environmental protection efforts, but they tend to be voluntary, not policy oriented, and normally it's more in the realm of like planting trees or something along those lines. So I'd love to hear your insight on that.
Yeah, it's a complicated question, just in the sense that there are a lot of corporations that do actively lobby for certain types of supply chains and processes that ostensibly are better for the environment. So the idea is looking at sort of the entire cost of a system in that sense. So when you're looking at, there are certain B corporations, for instance, that have rigorous sort of policies that they have to implement to qualify as B corporations that maybe have stronger environmental policy areas. So groups like Patagonia, et cetera. Like, so not necessarily an endorsement of those organizations, but they do commit themselves to a more rigorous standard of their supply chains, their processes, their policies, their mitigation of environmental impact to push for that. And some have action committees that have supported conservation efforts, for instance, to protect environmental areas. You also have major tech corporations that have voluntarily made improvements to their supply chains or to where they're getting key components from to apply to comply better with international human rights standards, to comply better with environmental standards. The question is, in the sense that that is voluntary, I always promote that people and corporations should be doing everything they can do. Also, there is the role of the government to mandate that these things happen. So I think the idea is that what we really want to focus on at Earth Justice and is really looking at where's the government's role in making sure that we understand the impacts of these industries and that we're creating policies that they have to comply with through the law that will make sure that this is happening, whether that's volunteering or not, to be completely honest.
Amazing. And exploring this idea of for-profit companies and their environmental policies. Another question I wanted to ask is some companies, spend an immense amount of money on lobbying against climate policy while also claiming social responsibility and perhaps donating towards some charitable causes, and saying that they care for the environment. So, right, this would be an example of a fossil fuel company spending millions of dollars lobbying against anti-climate policies, but then maybe planting some trees or what have you, what other voluntary thing they spend their money on. I'd love to know your idea on what is wrong with this framework, if anything, and how can the companies address this hypocrisy?
What we really want to be able to do is to verify these claims.
Mm,
I think there are a lot of actions from corporations that may be beneficial. What are they claiming that that is doing for the ultimate sort of goals that they're trying to reach? It's something that consumers should be able to understand and know and not have obfuscated. So some of the work that Earth Justice has done recently in partnership with environmental groups and also the state of New York is address some of these what we call greenwashing claims that some organizations have had, such as Tyson's Chicken. If you look at Earth Justice's website, this was a claim around some of their processes that claim to be net zero that did not have the backing science to claim that what they were doing was creating a net zero environment, which for folks who don't understand that term or don't know that term, is really around how do you mitigate greenhouse gases in your production. So there's always going to be some environmental externality in terms of potentially greenhouse gas production that can warm the climate. And if you're taking steps to ultimately take that greenhouse gas or an equivalent amount out of the atmosphere for what you're putting in is what typically is considered net zero. So there have been claims around that with certain organizations like JBS Beef, Tyson's, that have had recent settlements that have debunked the claims that they have around being net zero. So what we really want to make sure that we have is transparency and the scientific rigor and backing to be able to say if a company is pursuing an environmental claim, all the best to them. We definitely want that to be happening, and we need to make sure that that is actually doing the thing that it says it's doing. So I think that's the idea behind it, is that there is rigor and enforcement and transparency to make sure that consumers aren't being misled in their choices and that they have the transparency to know how to make decisions for their consumerism, because we all need to buy products and to exist and live in the world, that we can make decisions for our values that are based on accurate information.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. This is my last question. I'd love to know what are some resources that we, the audience, should turn to and maybe some simple actions that we can take. And of course, please share any parting words.
Yeah, shameless plug, go to earthjustice.org and check out all of the various work that we're doing. We've been around for 50 years working on every environmental issue you can possibly probably think of and
Mhm.
have worked in states. I think that's
Mhm.
where a lot of momentum is happening in the absence of maybe federal action, where states like California and New York and Colorado and have a lot of momentum to drive environmental policy forward, despite maybe inaction from the federal government, and continue to build momentum for why we need to protect the environment. And a lot of that work is happening through Earth Justice and our partners in those locations. So I would definitely say check out earthjustice.org to see if there's any actions you can take, hearings you can show up to, actions you can send to your decision makers in the federal government or the state government, and also really paying attention to where you're getting the information that you want to get from trusted sources. As a communications professional, I always see there's a lot of information that is really hard to understand these days. There's a lot of obfuscated information, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. So, really developing media literacy to understand where you're getting accurate information to be able to make informed decisions is really key to people being empowered to be able to do the things that they want to do and not be misled.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time and insight. And to everyone who came in and listened, thank you so much for your time as well. I hope that this was informative and exciting. And I hope that you feel inspired to make an environmental change and fight for our communities. And with that, I'll let you guys go and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.